Mozart's Twinkle, Twinkle variations. With this exercise, we are going to learn and explore possible ways to analyzing variation sets. So let's get started. I've chose this variation set because it's fairly manageable and it really is pretty easy. All analysis of these larger forms should start with becoming familiar with the tune by ear. So at this point, if you haven't listened to it already, please stop this video and find a recording. There should be one on your D2L or such platform. We're going to begin with the theme. Upon observation, we notice that the theme is in 2/4 time, and the theme is a familiar theme, and Mozart decides that it would be beneficial to set this to a very simple accompaniment, quarter notes. And the quarter notes simply form interval harmony with the melody line, and we find usual suspect chords that we would expect. We're in the key of C, and I'm going to do a complete harmonic analysis of the theme, because that way, when we find variation or deviation from the harmonic analysis of the original theme, we can understand that as one of our variation techniques. So he sets the theme to a very diatonic collection of chords. One of our uses of 4/6/4 as a pedal progression. Remember, there are 4 uses of 6/4 chords. And then in the next measure here, noticing that it would be possible to put 2 chords in each measure, but again, when we do a texture reduction, sometimes we push intervals together to form chords. I like my harmonic analysis to be as simple as possible. We're going to imply a 2 here because we have a D and an F. A is missing, but let me say first inversion, 2/5/1. And so we have this little circle progression here, 6/2/5/1. On the second half of the binary theme, we move to a dominant pedal point. And just to be consistent with how we understand this chord in ear training, I will call this 1/6/4. 5/7, notice the 7th is in the soprano. So this is a real pedal 6/4 chord. And then we're going to repeat that. This time, coming out on a tonic. And then we have this 5 with a 6/4, 5/3 suspension. And the rounding out of the binary form is the same as the first 2 phrases, so I'll just leave it at this to expedite the analysis. So Mozart chose a very simple tune, all quarter notes with the exception of this little decoration, this little escape tone decoration. We notice it's a dotted figure. He also adds some ornamentation. The tune is a folk tune. This is a very common practice to create variations on familiar tunes. And so that little decoration he includes at the very end. So when a tune is very simple, it makes it possible to do a very complex set of variations with it. So my message is, when you compose your own variations, start with something very simple, like Ode to Joy, for instance, and use that as the basis of your variations. Use that as your theme. The more complex and problematic the melody is, the less you can do with it. Variation 1. Variation 1 is an embellishment of the melodic line. He has an upper neighbor tone that's accented and a lower neighbor tone. And so what I'm going to do is circle the tones that belong to the theme. There's our C, there's our G, and an A. When he reaches A, which is this climax tone here, he begins to kind of fill out the space above with more of this filigree. There's our G and F, E, D, and C. For each of the variations, this is the first task, to try to find where the notes that make up the theme are hidden. So if we continue this process, G, F, E, D, and then we repeat G, F, E, and then in this measure here we find the D over here, and then the last half of the binary form is the same as the first. So again, I will move along here. So now we can begin to fill out the grid. Let's take a look at that. So variation 1 is in the home key of C. The meter remains 2/4. The main rhythm pattern that is used 16ths. So we can just kind of make a little rhythm pattern to show that that's the primary pattern. Because rhythmic variation is one of the most common types of variation technique, we would expect to find various types of rhythms in this box. And then finally, the techniques used. Here we can go back to the chapter and just go through the list and ask ourselves, are we finding evidence of any of the types of techniques we made on the list on that other grid? This variation primarily features embellishment. I'm just going to shorten that up, embellishment. Okay, melodic embellishment. When we go back and look at the variation again, we may notice that there's a C sharp here. That C sharp really changes the harmony at this moment here. This C sharp is acting like a neighbor tone to the D. However, if we include the G above it and try to figure out an implied harmony with the two notes, we might understand that as 7 diminished of 2. So this unit right here is then replicated in the next measure. And when we look at that 7 diminished to 2, which would be spelled C sharp E G, again we're missing the E, which is unusual to drop the third, but it is a tritone and we can imply a harmony. And if we do this, it's kind of interesting what happens. This 7 diminished of 2, and I think a triad, and then 2. And the next bracketed bit here, he has the same progression, this time associated with the tonic. Okay, and remember, when you have a pattern that is a melodic pattern repeated at various pitch levels, we call that a sequence. When we have a pattern of chords that repeats, in this case 7 diminished to 2 goes to 2, and then 7 diminished goes to 1, we call that a harmonic motive, okay, or a harmonic sequence. So it's not really a big deal here, but it is present. So I'm going to include it in my variation techniques. Again, I'm going to do some abbreviating here so we can move along. Harmonic sequence seems to be present. Notice that I didn't do harmonic analysis of every moment because most of it relates back to the theme. And it's on to variation 2. Variation 2, we start to see that the melodic material is becoming more dense with harmony. But we can still go and look for our main notes, and we can find them. They're a little easier to find because they're not woven into that embellishment. Okay. So, but they are there in the places we expect to find them. And we won't do them all. I think you can do some of these on your own at this point, but let's just circle. I didn't have to circle that one. What we see here is the simple accompaniment is now woven out. Okay, it's spun out. And if we really look at how the accompaniment is spun out, you can see that the tonic pitch and then a lower neighbor tone and an upper neighbor tone. Okay, so Mozart in this case is very cleverly using this motivic concept from variation 1, and he's reconstituting it as a change of accompaniment, almost an Alberti type figure in variation 2. This is typical that variations as they progress will build on each other and material will get passed from variation to variation. Let's take a look at the harmony here, because he does do something very interesting with the harmony. We see all these ties. We see C is tied throughout this because it's acting as a pedal tone for these 3 bars, and then it ultimately becomes a chord tone. But then the upper voice is held in suspension, resolves, held in suspension, resolves, and then held in suspension and resolves. That's called a chain suspension. Okay, so that's an increased dissonance. Remember, suspension types are always measured against the bass. And in this case, the bass line is the first note of the measure. So I'm going to measure the G against the E. Okay, that is a third. Okay, but then when F comes along, that third, as a consonance, that third evolves into a ninth. And so the ninth then resolves to an octave. And then the F, which is now a chord tone, is held over. We measure that against the bass here. It's a little easier to see that. You can see that's a fourth, resolving to a third. Again, I'm taking this note and I'm pushing it back to the actual bass. And now the E. Now the E, which is tied. Now that's a fifth. Okay. And that fifth, when it resolves down by step, the chord changes. So in that case, the E looks like a suspension, but in fact it's just tied, and it does look like it resolves down by step, but it resolves as a chord tone. Okay, so we have this interesting change of harmony, and then as he progresses through, he begins to elaborate, and because the chords are changing now, one per measure, he can't have that double under over neighbor bit. So when we look at the chords here, I can analyze these, and when I do that, I discover, well, another suspension here, but this one doesn't have a tie. We have a tonic chord, and then 6, and then that suspension, okay, that D, which is suspended, resolves, and it's kind of a curious thing, because when it does resolve, the chord changes. Then as we go along, we discover a 2-6-5 chord and a 5 and a 1. Okay, pretty interesting on the second half of the phrase that he's changed these chords. We have 6, 5, 6, 5, 1, and then 6 is reestablished. Then now 2, 6, 5, and 1. And that circle progression that takes us back to the tonic. So when it comes to the grid helps us kind of survey the theme with variations here. The key is C. Time signature is still 2-4. Now then, the primary rhythm is the 16th note here. So I'm just going to put dittos. So here, variation technique is change of accompaniment, or Alberti figure, but also the addition of suspensions and change of harmony. Okay, and we might make the observation that that this is a copycat this change of accompaniment is copycat of variation 1. Okay, that's enough there. I think we get the lay of the land. And so off we go to variation 3, and that'll be in the subsequent video.